Salutations from space. This is Gemini Brett and Gary Caton with episode 7 of Standing Rock Astrology. Today is November 3rd, 2016, Thursday, Jupiter's Day. How in the heavens are you, Gary?
I'm doing all right, brother. How you doing?
I'm doing good. We've been on a marathon here, and I'm a little wiped out, as I imagine you are too. And today we're meant to further our journey into space and to meet Saturn, the ringed one out there, in this standing rock chart that we've been looking at. I wanted to start, though. I've been reading more of this Lakota star knowledge book, which I really recommend. I found it hard to find when I was looking for it at first, and I just want to share where I received it from because they probably still sell it. It's a store called Grandfather's Spirit in Minnesota. So grandfathersspirit.com. If anyone's called to look more into this book, Lakota.
What's the name of it?
Grandfather's Spirit is the store in Minnesota. Grandfathersspirit.com. But the book is called Lakota Star Knowledge, so you could also search that. By a man called Ronald Goodman, who is working with Lakota to bring back this kind of lost star knowledge.
Wow.
And I just want to read a few passages. One, because it confirms, I guess, that as I think we would imagine, these people connected to the stars in the way that we do in experiential astrology. So I'll read a passage about that first. And so in the introduction, it says, research into Lakota stellar theology has added new dimensions to our understanding of how the people generated the mentality for experiencing the sacred. It shows that they felt a vivid relationship between the macrocosm, the star world, and their microcosmic world on the plains. There was a constant mirroring of what is above by what is below. Indeed, the very shape of the earth was perceived as resembling the constellations. For example, the Red Clay Valley, which encircles the Black Hills, looks like, and through oral tradition is correlated with, a Lakota constellation which consists of a large circle of stars. So we looked a couple episodes ago at the sacred hoop of stars that Venus at the time of this Fort Laramie Treaty was right in the middle of, right at the Milky Way. And this is also mapped on the land around the Black Hills. And they say that two tanned hides were found, and one has a map of the Black Hills with the same correlations to the other hide shows this map of the sacred hoop in the sky. And so they're clearly showing this kind of as above, so below connection. Furthermore, and this is what really excited me about this chart that we've chosen to use. So they go on to speak about this constellation that separates the winter and the spring. And we know from oral tradition that many of the Lakota bands wintered in western South Dakota and Nebraska. We know that one of the main ritual tasks of winter to be completed before the coming of the first thunders the following spring was the gathering of red willow. The inner bark of this tree is the principal ingredient in the smoking mixture used while praying with the chanupa, with the sacred pipe. Red willow is also, I know, the wood that is used principally for anipi, for sweat lodge, for the actual construction of the lodge, right? Thus, the dried willow, it's a constellation that denotes the end of winter or the beginning of spring. The constellation formed with stars and triangulum in Aries looks like a branch with the bark stripped off. When the sun enters it, their conjunction announces that the people are or should be ready to follow the teachings of the sacred pipe for another year. And so we were looking at this in the sky. Let me share my screen here. Where is Stellarium? There you are. Okay, so here's this time. And let me bring in Stellarium. I'll switch over to like Lakota View. And they don't have all of the constellation mentioned in this book here, but they have many of them. So this is what we're talking about. They're kind of hard to see here, but the ram's head, when we were looking at the sun aligned to Hamal, this star of the ram, and then triangulum above, this was seen as the willow. And they go on in this book to talk about, Goodman talks about how the Big Dipper was seen as this traditional spoon that's used to bring the flame, which is the sun, here to the pipe where the red willow is, to spark basically the seasonal or the yearly pipe so they can live by the ways of the Chanupa for the following year.
Hmm.
The sacred hoop, which we were looking at with Venus in, is shown here, is also called the racetrack, which we talked about a bit ago. And I'm looking at 2016 here. Hold on, let me go back to 1868. So we see Venus right there in the middle. Uranus is in the hoop as well. And there's constellations here. So the moon's aligned. And really amazingly, and we spent a lot of time looking at the fish and Pegasus above. But this they called the elk. You can see the head of the elk here. And so
Right.
Mercury, Mars, Jupiter also aligned. So basically every visible planet at the time of this chart that we're looking at was in these constellations known in different ways by the Lakota. And I'm not going to go on to all of them. Maybe I'll make a different movie just about this, right? So there's several constellations that they looked at. We don't have the whole sky. It kind of looks like they only had memories, or there's like field drawings from a priest that was out there who was trying to preserve some of this knowledge, I think. And it looks like they only kind of have half the sky or half the year. But I love seeing that in this chart that we're using, all of the planets at the time of this Fort Laramie Treaty were in these sacred constellations. So there's one other thing I wanted to read, because only one of the planets, and we're about to talk about that one, Saturn, is not in one of the constellations mapped, at least acknowledged in this book. And I want to read this thing too that Red Cloud had to say to the government officials. That the buffalo had been given by Great Spirit to the Lakota, the buffalo for food and clothing. We told them that where the buffalo ranged, that was our country. We told them that the country of the buffalo was the country of the Lakota. We told them that the buffalo must have their country, and the Lakota must have the buffalo. And, you know, we hear about the destruction of the buffalo as a way of taking the food resource from these people and the resource for clothing and that, but he's saying it's a lot more than just this, yeah? And we're hearing that he told the government that so they knew it was a lot more. But Goodman goes on to say this, I think this will lead us to Saturn in this chart. The repeated use of the word must in his speech is the sign that what Red Cloud is referring to is religious duty, and not merely economic necessity or political control. He's referring to the need for religious freedom. So I was hoping, I think you'll feel me there, that that's a decent intro to speak about a retrograde Sagittarius Saturn and religious freedom and a need for religious duty.
Yeah, I mean, religious as the source is, of course, associated with Sagittarius. Sagittarius is the first of what modern astrologers call the transpersonal signs, right? So the first four signs, Aries through Cancer, speak to very personal needs. Aries is just the I am. I have a right to exist, right? Which, unfortunately, not all people on this planet have always been acknowledged for that very basic right to even exist, yeah? And then, you know, so Aries is the I am, Taurus is I have, Gemini is I think, Cancer is I feel, right? So those are very personal relationships with the world. In Leo, you have a creative response to life that wants to be seen, that needs to be on the stage, right? And the stage implies an audience. So there's an interpersonal dynamic that begins in Leo. Virgo needs someone to serve. Libra needs someone to be in balance with. Scorpio needs someone to dominate or to explore power with. And then when you get to Sagittarius, the other that was implied in the four interpersonal signs becomes Great Spirit in the case of the Lakota, yeah. So with Christians, it's, you know, or Jewish people, it's Yahweh, you know, whatever. There's this relationship with a higher power, right? In Capricorn, it becomes the state or the government or the tribal council in the case of the First Nations people. In Aquarius, it's of course humanity. It's the it's the tribe, and then in Pisces, it's just the universe, right?
Mm-hmm.
So these last 4 signs are very transpersonal, and yeah, so religious ideas of religiosity are very much tied with Sagittarius, right? The archer's pointing his bow towards the far horizon, like what's out there, what happens after we die, right? We talked about this idea of this part of the constellational zodiac being about different ways of relationship with death. What happens after we die? Where do we go? These questions that can only be answered by religion. You know, we don't have any experiential, science cannot touch that question, yeah? So they try to pretend like it's not a worthy question, because you can't have any testable knowledge. Well, so they say. I mean, that's another whole philosophical discussion anyways. But yeah, so there you go. There's your religious themes for sure with Sagittarius. And Saturn, I mean, so the other thing about, you know, Sagittarius is because it's ruled by Jupiter, it has this sense of expansiveness and freedom, you know. But Saturn is kind of the opposite of, you know, Saturn in mythology was this child swallowing tyrant, you know. And, you know, Saturn takes 29 years to go around the zodiac, yeah? So that's a long time. That's more, you know, if a generation is 20 years, that's like more than a generation's time. And so there's a really broad range of, you know, Saturn can be the authority figure, which can be good or bad. Yeah, it can be a tyrant, or it can be like the wise elder. And it can also be the so-called dregs of society, like the beggars or the oppressed. Yeah. So like there's a huge kind of tension here between the archetype of Saturn and the archetype of Sagittarius. There's not any necessarily, it's not like there's any Saturn's in debility or anything like that in Sagittarius that I know of. But there's just a tension between the nature of the two, right? You can feel that they're kind of very different in their expressions.
Yeah, and it's a good time to feel it because as we are recording this, Saturn is now in Sagittarius. Happens every 29 and a half years during Saturn's orbit. And Saturn ingress Sagittarius at the very end of December 14, dipped back in for some final feathers of the Phoenix burning into Scorpio for a time, and then has come back full on into Sagittarius. I believe it was June 14th, 2015. I can't remember exactly, but we'll be there for another year and a half about. And Saturn's right in the middle degrees of Sagittarius now. So if you really want to, people out there, learn Saturn and Sagittarius, get out there and sit with Saturn and ask him or ask her. Mm-hmm. And Saturn has a very authoritative stance. It's the voice of the elders. Yeah. And I think this is one of the things that we hear the Lakota are kind of demanding is like the return of the matriarchal council of grandmothers at the top. And Saturn is usually seen as the bearded white man, the old man, or even as the grim reaper, right? Saturn has a pretty bad rap in the astrological traditions for sure, and tends to show himself that way. In the course of life, when we see that Saturn note in the Song of the Soul, the birth chart. But Saturn as the Capricorn side, traditionally known as Capricorn as a earth, as a femininity, and that sometimes I think is lost in modern thought as we've kind of disconnected ourselves from the council of the grandmothers, which is also alive in Saturn. I often bring people out into the field who don't know the stars or the planets, and this summer a lot it was, you know, Mars and Saturn very prominent. And I'd say, okay, kind of pick that one or pick that one and just sit with them and then tell me what you see. And I heard a lot with Saturn of, it's this grandmother who's teaching me about time, which is very interesting. And this kind of linear cyclical time.
Well, so, you know how many moons Saturn has?
A lot. How many?
Yeah. I don't know. There's so many.
30 something?
Yeah. It's like, my goodness, and he's spawning moons. Saturn just had a baby.
Hmm.
Yeah. It's like, wow, like that's trippy to think of Saturn in that fashion. Yeah. Because we
Yeah.
have the whole idea of this child-eating monstrous male figure, right? That unfortunately we've been all too ready to embody, especially with respect to the indigenous people. But what if we change the story that it's the grandmother time instead of grandfather time?
Yeah, I mean, even in the Greco-Roman tradition where Saturn castrated his father and ate his children, it wasn't really a nice dude. He did like reign over a golden age on Earth and was known to be a god of the land and agriculture. There's a thing on Saturn that I've been connecting to lately that's just such a wonder. I'm sure you've seen it, which is these satellite images of this like perfect hexagon at Saturn's North Pole.
Yeah.
And this is called the seed of life geometry, which people probably know. And to me, this is where the zodiac like actually emanates from all of the planets connected to their poles. I'm calling it the directional zodiac, and it's so cool because I've been watching this on Saturn. It's actually changing colors.
Yeah.
And Saturn's just moving into his summer solstice soon, right? So I feel like it's actually kind of seasonally tuned, and that we would actually see it literally change colors as Saturn's moving through Saturn's signs. But to get back to this and astrologically, I mean, when I sit in council with people and look at their chart, I often explain Saturn as wisdom earned, right? And that Saturn is freedom because Saturn is the cage, and there is no freedom without the cage. And that great teaching of restriction, of the skin, as Saturn's the last visible, he's the edge of the solar system, the slowest moving, keeps us in. I feel like if it was up to Jupiter, we would just like ascend back into angel being before the Earth came even before.
Right.
And Saturn actually keeps us here so that we can play because perhaps we chose to. So you have that tension, but that's also like serves as the capacitor, the keeping the potential energy in until you're ready to go kinetic with it.
Gravity becomes gravitas. Yeah. My friend Kelly Lee Phipps used to say Saturn is about planning your work and working your plan, you know. So there's a structuring element to it. It's definitely not all bad, but it definitely does live up to the ancient moniker of being a malefic at times, you know.
Yeah, and those teachings of hardship, and we look at this in an individual's chart, oftentimes at Saturn return, 30 years old, you kind of start breaking out of that mold a little bit and into like the next layer of it, whatever. And that's not true for everyone. And for me, it was like the next Saturn alignment, 37, where I feel like I really started catching up to the promise of Saturn in my chart. But
yeah, different people experience it differently, yeah.
Yeah.
I got married at my Saturn return, bought a house, all that stuff. And I mean, this is a guy who had been hitchhiking around the country, was homeless. Yeah.
Yeah, I was the same. So I should say that about Saturn return. I mean, I got a job. I graduated college after having dropped out and being a touring musician for years and years, right? Something we kind of share in that regard. And of getting a house, those kinds of things. Yeah, so kind of Saturn. But it was 7 years later where I started, I think, connecting to the freedom of that. Because even that, like coming into like a square job and stuff, isn't me. And so having felt that, it was like more opportunity to experience the way that world and authority figures and expectations of what success means and all those things, right, are coming in. And it's like, that's not like where I'm comfortable. And sometimes we have to get so uncomfortable to bust out of it, right? And that's what I mean, that like the obstacles themselves are the source of the breakthrough.
Yes.
And Saturn can work in that way. And I would feel that for a nation, it's not going to happen at Saturn return. And we always see a sense of it, but it's probably going to be a longer process, right? Because a nation lives for a much, much longer time.
Right.
And so Saturn and Sagittarius, when we're speaking about religious freedom and just freedom in general, I mean, last time I talked about Sagittarius as the smoke that rises. I love that because it just travels where it wants to go. You watch smoke and it's on its own path, you know? But what happens if you try to build a chimney around that? I mean, sometimes that can be really useful because you can focus that directly to the heavens. But what if there's a chimney that's not allowing you to be free? And what if there's a flue that just stops it altogether? And in some ways, where Red Cloud in this passage is talking about you know, basically the religious duty of being with the buffalo. So destroying the buffalo destroys the spirit itself. Yeah.
Yeah, and what's beautiful about this treaty in terms of like, what Red Cloud was able to achieve is that it defined a reservation, but they still had the rights to hunt in Colorado and Wyoming. In fact, there were certain places in this treaty where the white people couldn't go. It was only for the First Nations to hunt.
Mm.
And because my understanding of the Eastern tribes is that's what Kentucky was originally a place where even the indigenous people didn't settle there. It was just this hunting ground, and all the tribes could come and hunt there, but they didn't live there, so that there was always this place where they could go hunt, where there was wild game, and it hadn't been, sort of thinned out, because, if you hunt right next door to where you live, of course, it thins out the game.
Mm.
So if there's this place where you can go hunt, kind of like a reserve, so, I mean, I think it's reflected in the treaty, what he's saying. And so it shows great wisdom and great foresight on his part, not just as a warrior, but clearly he was very, very much a chief, in that he was guarding the multi-generation, truth of his people, and trying to make it clear to these people that he was dealing with honorably. This is our needs. This is our sacred contract with our God. Yeah.
Mm.
And, it just fell on deaf ears, unfortunately, or it fell on ears that heard and used that truth to basically attempt to exterminate them. I mean, this idea that there's, of genocide, I think, is really important to accept fully and completely. Not just to say the word, but I mean, because, my wife is half Armenian. Her mother is the child of people who came over from Armenia, and they were fleeing the Turks, right? There's a whole genocide story there between the Turks who committed genocide on the Armenians, and it's really sad to see the loss of culture. That I've seen it personally there,
Mm-hmm.
And I can't imagine what it's like to be a member of a people who have had that perpetrated on them. I mean, it's inconceivable,
Yeah, I mean, it's happened in so many places, and it's kind of easier in history to learn about that far away. Now, this is part of your history because you're married to a woman who's half Armenian, right? But I mean, we'll see that in the history books. We'll hear obviously about the Holocaust, like.
Unfortunately, we don't hear it in the history books. The thing is, one of Obama's promises was that he would finally acknowledge the Armenian genocide.
Mm.
He didn't do it. And I'll tell you why I think he didn't. Guess what? When you start acknowledging those other genocides that you weren't, guess what? Then what about the genocide that you perpetrated?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and that's
Yeah.
what I'm saying. Like, far away is easier for us to look at. I guess I only heard about the Armenians and the Turks, though, from Armenian friends. I used to play in a band with a man that's his lineage. So I didn't learn that in school, but I wasn't interested really in history until astrology, because now I'm looking at turning back these pages and seeing how the heavenly harmonies reflect what's happening on Earth, and it's amazing, right? And that's part of what we're doing here. But I just felt like what I was being taught in school wasn't necessarily real. And it took me longer to realize that in science class too. But anyway, it's said that the Nazis actually learned from the way that this genocide was conducted here against the native tribes in America, right? So this is a very real thing. I mean, numbers that I've seen is a reduction from about 8 million native Americans at the time of Columbus showing up to 250,000 in 1900. It makes the aliens of my phone sing. Sorry. I mean, that's amazing. And there's some links in all of the descriptions of these series to check out some documentaries that are a pretty heavy watch, you know?
Yeah.
And I just want to mention too, Gary, before I forget, I also linked a bunch of different places where you can contribute to this cause of Standing Rock and donate. Gary sent over a lot of cool links for me yesterday. And if you have ones that you want to share, please share them in the YouTube comments, and I'll post them into the description too. Because people are asking, how can we contribute? And
right.
Just to state that again, like, we can spread the word. That's one of the things we're trying to do here. People don't know about Standing Rock right now. And the more awareness is, the less chance of atrocity happening there, because things are heating up.
Yeah, and if anybody's on Facebook, like I've joined an event that has these links in it and also has the numbers where you can call your Congress people and call President Obama and everything. There's a, no DAPL event on Facebook and stuff. So, you can check stuff out there and everything. It's really important that first and foremost, we recognize that basically what we're standing up to here, what we're standing with the Standing Rock people, but what we're standing up against is genocide, because it's still happening. You see? That's what I don't think people get. Oh yeah, we did this genocide to the Native Americans. We're still doing it. Okay? This is a death sentence for people if this oil gets in their water. I mean, my God, why is this so hard to understand? And we just as recently as the 1940s, when they built all these dams, they did the same thing. See, what happened with this pipeline, and is that they were going to take it up through Bismarck, right, or one of those cities where all the white people live, and they said, we don't want that thing in our backyard. So what they do? Stick it in the natives' backyard, right? They did the same thing with these dams, right? Nobody wanted their land flooded. Well, we'll just flood the Indian land because we have this great tradition in America, although we were founded on the principle that all men are created equal, which right there's sexism in this statement. You're trying to claim freedom for all people to be created equal, and yet you're saying it's just men. And then we had this great tradition where we treated other people as fractions of people, and so then, here we are treating people as even less than fractions, as non-people. So yeah, flood their lands, run the oil through their land, We're still freaking doing it. I'm trying really hard not to use the F word there.
I hear you. I'm trying really hard just not to cry my eyes out right here. I mean, I've been watching these documentaries, and it's difficult, and not to feel the guilt in this, and just like the lack of awareness and the lack that we're not taught this. And so I just feel the more aware that we can personally become, and then spread this word, like, that awareness alone is a prayer. It connects us, right? So we can send money, we can spread the word, we can call people, we can keep the phone lines like occupied, literally at the White House. But you can also just go into those places that, like, where the dam is inside, and it's like, oh, I can't go past that one because it just rips my heart open. I'm just gonna, this is why my eyes look like this. I haven't been sleeping, but I've also just been like in a state of like terror about what's been done. And this is the Saturn episode, folks, so it's going to sound a bit like
it's tough, man. It's tough, but you got to call it what it is. This is a crime against humanity. That's what's going on here. It's a crime against humanity, and it's ongoing, and it's got to freaking stop, man.
Yeah, and we've got Native people imploring help from other countries. Who is going to come?
The United Nations, right? Because our own leaders won't listen.
Right, and that's. Right, and that's, our leaders are a reflection of us, right? Politically, supposedly, but spiritually, definitely, right? We are all one, so that is a reflection of us. So this means that we won't listen, right? And so everyone tuning into this and making it through this portion of the show today certainly is tuning in, is willing to listen, and it's not easy. And Saturn's not easy. Saturn is this world that we can touch. It's reality, yeah? And so there's a beautiful thing here with a retrograde Saturn and Sag, who's actually taking us back to the old wisdom and the old way of grounding spirit. But there's a huge challenge too of a retrograde Saturn Sagittarius, and I think it's shown up throughout the history. I mean, just think about part of this treaty was education, right? Which can be a Sagittarian theme in ways. And what happened asking the authority for education, and then the boarding schools came forth, which we touched upon a little bit before too. So there, it's just kind of working backwards. So maybe you could tell us about like a traditional view of what a retrograde planet is. This is the only retrograde planet in the Standing Rock chart that we're looking at.
Right, and it's also the only planet in an entire hemisphere. As you said, it's extremely ironic that it happens to be the hemisphere that's somehow missing in the transmission for the Lakota zodiac and sky lore. Yeah, so you know, it's really ironic there. So Saturn in this chart is really, really powerful and potent for a few reasons. It's the only planet in half the sky. We call that a singleton. So that there's this tremendous, you know, like almost like a dish, right? A satellite dish over here on the left. It's like a bowl.
Right, I stripped this down. Sorry to interrupt you, Gary. I stripped this down to only what's visible.
Right.
The nodes out and some of the outer planets. So we've got this bowl of visible planets and pointing to Saturn here.
Right. So imagine that as like a bowl, like a satellite dish or whatever, right? And then everything's beaming in and out of that dish through Saturn. Yeah. So Saturn becomes an extremely focalized planet in this chart, and it's retrograde, which means it's actually very bright because planets are retrograde when they're closest to Earth. What's going on from a heliocentric point of view is that the Earth is passing Saturn, right? And because it's faster, it's just like when you pass a car on the highway, right? And for a second, if you look, oh wow, going backwards, yeah, there's this illusion. So that traditionally, you know, retrograde planets were said to represent people who were just acting backwards, right? And that's been the thing. That's been the thing that's been driving this Holocaust the whole time, is assuming, I mean, what is white supremacy except thinking that our way is not just better, but the only way? That's what it is. And, you know, and so you go in and you think, you know, and these missionaries, they literally think they're doing good deeds by treating these people as if they're backwards idiots, you know, who don't have any clue about how to live. And the extreme irony there is, if we had just left them alone, they could have lived on this land for thousands and thousands of years, and in a matter of a few hundred, we've rendered it nearly uninhabitable, you know? So it's like, who's really backwards here? You know what I'm saying? But what I've learned about retrograde planets is that it's not, you can't just see in one dimension, yeah? Because one-dimensional thinking is the trap that where you get into this good guys, bad guys, you know, the right way, the wrong way, you know, like it's one-dimensional thinking. Because what retrogrades planets actually do, they don't just go forward and backwards on a flat plane. They actually do these looping shapes in the sky where they go up and then back down, or down and then back up, yeah? So there's this at very least two-dimensional quality to it but essentially what they do is, in a very short time, they actually not just go east and west, but north and south. They go all four directions. So it's kind of like an Aoka medicine, but I would say it's more of a searching, it's more of a, you know, that idea that all who wander are not lost. This is why we call the planets. Planet comes from the word to wander. These are also known as wandering stars, yeah? This is where the wandering comes in. They're going around, they're searching for something, they're looking. When you're just going along in a straight line, you're oblivious to what's out to the side, right? You're not paying attention. You're not really taking it in. But when you're going like this, all of a sudden there's many points of view available. If you're if you're really experiencing it, you know. And I think it's very clear here who is open to many points of view and who isn't, you know, culturally speaking. So that, you know, the problem comes from when you take this retrograde planet and you put blinders on it and you want to pretend like it's, you know, and try to shove it into this, you know, narrow little percent of reality that you insist is all there is, you know.
Mm.
And we do it time and again, not just with cultures, but with, you know, it used to be religion that we used to do this to people. Now we do it with science. You know, if it doesn't fit in the scientific paradigm, it's nonsense. And it's, you know, it's like, when are we going to freaking get over this? You know,
Right. When are we going to learn that actually it's better to admit that we don't know everything, because then we can learn, right?
right?
It's so obvious, right? So yeah, to point out a couple of things on this chart, I mean, it's so amazing with Saturn over here is the singleton, as we say, or it's kind of like that antenna of the satellite dish, as Gary mentioned. I mean, this one's like really perfect, because if you just look at what's visible here, okay, sun, moon, and then Mercury to Saturn, the midpoint of the dish is going to be between 2 degrees and about 6 degrees, which is 4 degrees Gemini.
Bam.
Right here, exactly opposite where Saturn is. I mean, it's so perfect. It's amazing. So Saturn's out here on his own, and Saturn's very bright at this time. Gary mentioned this because Earth is passing Saturn. I mean, the truth is Earth is the middle of these charts. This is a geocentric view of all the planets surrounding the charts. But if you were looking from the sun, the Earth would be exactly opposite over here, right? The Earth moves faster than Saturn, so Earth is cruising past Saturn at this time. And as Gary mentioned, just like passing a car on the highway, it appears that the other car is moving backwards for a time. Yeah. And the time where we are closest to Saturn is when the sun is exactly opposite Saturn, which would have happened about a month from here, 3 weeks, I guess. And so this means Saturn is super bright. Let's just see. It was May 23rd when the exact opposition happened, right?
Wow.
With the sun at that midpoint in Gemini that we were looking at. But so this is, and it's just like a full moon, which is when the sun and the moon are opposite sides of the Earth. The moon rises at sunset. The moon sets at sunrise. This is the case for Saturn. The guys at Sky Astrology Conference, Gary and Adam and Julian Packard-Lewis, have come to call this midnight star. Because when the sun sets and it rises, that planet dominates the entire night. And at midnight, it's at its height, right? And this is going down with Saturn at this time. So Saturn has a really strong power through this proximity, through this radiance. We can look again to what was happening in the sky here. And before this is well before the sun rose. You go back to that day. But yeah, so here is midnight. Well, kind of. There's a time zone change. Anyway, here's Saturn at his height. And there's a time where we see, like, before all this stuff rises, Saturn and actually the moon kind of are in the sky together. And we talked about the potential tension of a first quarter moon as well. So there's some symbolism here, like during the night and before these Aries planet rose, and before that the sun came to light the sacred pipe of the heavens, right? And before Venus rose to show herself in that sacred hoop. In fact, she wouldn't be seen until the sun set, and then very bright. There's some tension here, like in the darkness of the night, in the cold of the winter. And that's part of the, actually, just to bring modern times back. And this is one of the reasons why it's so important for us to share this word and to connect and to send money now, because it's getting very cold out there.
Yeah, and the government just send like millions of dollars to the cops, by the way.
For
so,
this
like,
particular standoff, yeah?
Yeah, right? So, like, you know, it's just unbelievable. It's like, but, you know, yeah, I mean, the thing is the government, I mean, the thing is that they can't win unless two things happen. If the natives or anybody associated with that movement resorts to violence, then they win. Because guess what? then they can be as violent as hell and be justified in doing it. Not be justified in the sense of like,
Spirit.
you know, spiritual or moral justice, but be justified in the sense of, you know, the law says, you know, if the police are being shot at, they're going to shoot back for sure, you know, and they're going to shoot back with a lot more force. And the only other way they can win is if we don't stay with it, if we don't stay the course. And that's what Saturn represents, is staying the course. So it doesn't matter that they have more money, we have more numbers, you know, and they can bring tanks, they can bring whatever, like, you know, if you want to waste your money on tanks to come after people who are praying, then you're just wasting your money, because a tank is useless against prayer.
Right. So like we shall overcome, and the peaceful movements of the 60s are reflected here in so many ways. I mean, I love that image of like the flower power dude sticking the rose in the rifle from back in the day, you know. That's
how do you fight them?
And how can we hold peace? But we saw things like in the Occupy movement of plants, right? Like coming into peaceful protests and being the one that picks up the garbage can and throws it through a window to start these riots. And then you can follow them back to like the police precinct. So people have to be careful of that. Like a fire was started out there recently, and the law is trying to blame it on the water protectors, where it seems it was somebody from the other side, from the pipeline crew, trying to stir things up. So we have to be really careful. And again, just awareness and speaking about this and spreading the word, and, you know, checking in on Facebook, whatever it is, to keep this in the...
And keep the love in your heart. I mean, it's really easy to be angry about this, but you know, to keep keep a commitment to nonviolence in our own heart, to nonviolence in our own hearts, can help keep the movement from, you know, suffering from that, because, you know, that's the one thing that really can defeat it. But yeah, you know, getting back to the whole thing with Saturn being the singleton, I mean, when something is the only thing, you think, well, it's sort of like it's on its own. It's like, but in astrology, what I've learned is that when you have something and it's the only thing, it stands out. It becomes more important, you know, and it becomes even more powerful because of that singularity. And so, you know, this Saturn in Sagittarius is just an extremely powerful archetype in this chart, where, you know, this Red Bull saying, you know, here's what our spiritual laws require, you know, and the other side saying, oh, great, we'll do everything we can to kill that, you know. And it's just, you know, it's I think it's really ironic that Saturn's in Sagittarius right now as it's coming back around.
Yeah, and kind of similar tactics, right? I mean, so back then, like, oh, you know, the buffalo are more than food. Oh, so then we better kill the buffalo. They just told us what the secret weapon is, right? And this time around, we discussed this, like people literally, when the truck started coming in, it's like, hey, we need to stop this, but just so you know, immediately, not that place, not that place. Here's the map of our sacred burial grounds. And what happened, that's exactly where they went to dig up the next day, this corporation. So these things are still very much happening right now. This is not something from our past that we're trying to heal. This is something that needs healing immediately.
Right now.
Present.
And the other thing is, with Sagittarius, it's often connected with the law, right? So so what I was referencing earlier, a commitment to nonviolence is a commitment to spiritual law. Right? But commitment to the law in terms of, you know, the Sioux people, and I have already won a court case against the U.S. government. The Supreme Court sided with the Sioux Nation against the United States government and said, you know, yeah, you took their land illegally. It's like probably the most blatant, you know, blatantly illegal thing we've ever decided, or some, you know, they said it was blatant. Yeah, but the solution was to give them the 1800s prices for the land, and then plus interest, which amounts to, like, you know, it seems like a lot of money to your average person, but by the time you divide that up amongst all the tribal members, it's not going to be that much, and it's not going to last that long. So land lasts forever.
Yeah,
So
there's some corruption of how the money's been distributed as well, and the money has raised from what the Supreme Court first offered. That's, I mean, it's like went from I think a million something to 18, and beautifully the tribes are like, no, you don't, you can't sell land, right?
yeah,
Land.
you don't get it, right? Yeah, you don't freaking get it. So like maybe we could finally get and honor, what it is they're asking for. Number one, but number two, um, there's going to be more of these court cases, right? If they keep bringing tanks to this thing, and the Sioux and their brothers and sisters in solidarity stay nonviolent, there will be more court cases, right? There will be, and that's how the 1960s civil rights movements, there were landmark. So we have Jupiter in Libra, which is a sign associated with law. We have Saturn in Sagittarius right now, which is a sign associated with law. So in that's the long range picture, right? You can't lose sight of in the short term. Yeah, they've got all these tanks and they've got all this money, but in the long term, this is a lot of the reason why, and I really hate to bring this in again, but I'll say it once again. I love you, Hillary Clinton. Please do the right thing. And one of the right things that you can do is do what people are expecting you to do, and that is appoint a judge that's not going to be a climate change denier or some other kind of radical right-wing position, but is going to, do what's just and right. Because if we get, right now there's basically a balance on the Supreme Court. And if we get a justice who isn't like taking some of these really weird right-wing positions, then it's very possible we could have, court cases that finally bring justice to this situation and finally bring, this new birth that's promised in the chart.
Yeah, I mean, we can't even get these, presidential candidates to speak about this movement. I mean, it's unreal. So, there's one more piece about Saturn. I think I would love to speak about the connections to Jupiter and to the moon. But we didn't look at Saturn, I guess, constellationally, which is
right.
something that we've done for the other planets. And he's in a very powerful place from the constellations that you and I work with, Gary. And where's my button? Right here. So here is Saturn at this time, right here, at this modern claw of the Scorpion, which actually used to be up here, but very close to a very bright star that's the heart of the Scorpion, Antares. He was approaching the Scorpion, and then he hit the brakes and turned around, and he's heading back towards the scales because Saturn is retrograde, which has an apparent motion through the zodiac. We can see that Saturn's above the ecliptic here. And Gary, maybe you can even tell from that, and knowing that Saturn's node is in Capricorn, what kind of motion he's doing this retrograde. But what I think is really important to share is that here we are going into this golden gate, going into galactic center, moving through this place of judgment as I see it in the weighing of the heart and the feather and the scales. And just above, and I love this, the serpent that Ophiuchus, the serpent tender, holds rises to the northern crown. I spoke about that a bit last time, but this is a very sacred and powerful place of the sky. It's also a very low place, like down to earth, the winter constellations for us in the northern hemisphere. So there's something about Sagittarius being kind of a lower or a southern constellation, and then Saturn being higher than other planets will be in that same constellation.
Right, so Saturn's in a north latitude here because Saturn's north node is in Cancer. Saturn's south node is in Capricorn, right? So from Cancer to Capricorn, he's traveling above the ecliptic, and then in Capricorn he dives down and crosses going below, so he's below so Saturn's in this hero's journey part of the finding the medicine, finding the medicine of the elder, which I can safely say we are surely still working on. I mean, all those dudes who got their faces carved in that mountain, for the most part, I mean, Thomas Jefferson, slave owner, so Same thing with George Washington, Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, they're human beings, even Abraham Lincoln, like, suspended habeas corpus, So even our leaders that we go to the trouble to carve into these mountains, still learning the medicine of true eldership. And, this is something where, like I said, even with Obama, a lot of people had really high hopes for him to be a different kind of leader, but ultimately there's, silence on this and the willingness to let this play out for a few more weeks.
Right.
It speaks volumes, man, to the lack of really learning that medicine of true eldership and really learning the medicine of what sustainability is, and so forth. So, but, being at this place where with this, like you said, that whole scene in the Egyptian, right, Book of the Dead, where after you're done, you go and you before the gods and they put your heart on the scales. And there's a feather of truth. Yeah. And you have to weigh it against that. And if it doesn't measure up, it gets eaten by the monster, the crocodile god. Yeah.
Is your heart as light as the feather of wisdom? And I mean, I think you spoke about it too, like heroes and gods, man, right? Because we spoke last time about hubris. And I mean, Lincoln to many of us is this like God, right? The Emancipation Proclamation, ending slavery in our country. Well, 2 days after the Emancipation Proclamation and a year after Lincoln signed the Homestead Act, which gave white settlers the right to move into this land that was reserved in this treaty for the native tribes.
Right.
48 Sioux men were hung in 1863. And I'll look at this chart as we move forward. But this was the largest mass execution ever in the United States, ever to this day. And it was signed by Lincoln 2 days after the Emancipation Proclamation. So it's important, and then his face is carved into one of the most sacred mountains to this tribe that he betrayed. And we know Obama was really like saying Lincoln's his guy, Lincoln's his hero, he's going to be like Lincoln. And he came into office and said, for the first time, we're going to honor, right, these genocides around the world. We're going to honor the native wisdom and the voice of all dealings that have to do with tribal lands, and even bring them in to hear that wisdom in all environmental decisions. He actually went out there to Standing Rock. He went to Rosebud. He gave his promise, and we're not seeing that. Yeah. So it's just important, I think, with Saturn, who says, be real. Yeah. And with Sagittarius, which we mentioned last time, can kind of get into a religiosity of this religion that we've been given is like, our country is the best, and, we're freeing the world and Operation Freedom and these kinds of things. If we get real with where we're at, if we're willing to face that hard place in our heart to free love, right? That's what we're up against. And that's where the cage actually does teach freedom, but it can be a long thing. And I think the beautiful sense of this Saturn at the heart, and retrograde Saturn maybe literally bringing us back to the ways of old and the ways of great spirit, and to release these heroes and these false gods so that we can connect to.
In popular parlance, what we're in need of is what's commonly called a come to Jesus moment, right? Because, I grew up a Southern Baptist, and I grew up poor, okay? And I've been homeless, and I've been hungry. And so, and I've had people look at me and say, you sleep like an animal on the ground. Yeah. But even that experience doesn't even begin to amount to a grain of sand to the mountain of what these people have experienced, but, in the Southern Baptist tradition, right, there's the preacher gets up there and basically, fire and brimstone, and you're a sinner, and that you can't be saved but through the grace of God, and, come to Jesus, baby, come get your sins cleansed away. And, you know, there's weeping and there's people. I mean, look, they're, you know, that's the thing, is that when you finally, there's tremendous freedom in finally saying, yes, I'm a sinner. Yes, I've screwed up horribly. But you can, and you can't ever take that back. You can't ever necessarily wipe it clean, but you can at least begin anew.
Yeah, you can't take
You
it
know,
back, but you can't move forward until you have that truth. Yeah.
you know, and so to me, that's what I see with Saturn and Sagittarius. It's like, come to Jesus, baby, you know, like own up to this and finally, once and for all, do the right thing.
Yeah, or come, you know, to the water, or come to
Yeah,
Great Spirit, or come to
right,
what it is for you, you know, and that's
right.
important. Don't do it the way that we tell you to do it.
Yeah, not saying you have to come to Jesus because that's the one and only true religion. I mean, heavens no, I don't believe that. Um, but yeah, come to a higher truth.
And
And
and as difficult as Saturn can be, there's also that potential here. And there's, I think this chart shows us, as it's pointing to Saturn, and Saturn's so bright and close and long lasting, and he's getting to his brightest and closest, right? Like the sun's moving into that opposition. It's coming to a place of getting brighter and being higher in the sky, being shown, being that midnight star. There's something in this where there is a seed of promise that's going to Saturn take some time to come through. I've been speaking lately about Saturn and Jupiter. You mentioned 20-year generations and how Saturn's longer than that. So that's something we might want to take a peek at quickly. But
yeah,
in those energies, I've been playing with this metaphor of comparing like the spiritual awakening to a hot air balloon ride into the heavens. And in a way, Uranus is like, oh, we could build this thing, right? But Jupiter is like the hot air that lifts you up. And you would go nowhere without Saturn, because Saturn is the fabric and Saturn is the basket in which you ride anyway, right? So at the fabric where that hot air is meeting, there's this tension between Jupiter and Saturn, but they're really on the same team, helping us rise. One just feels like it's constraining us, one's trying to expand us, and they work in this way of a friction that actually serves us in the long run.
That's a great metaphor. I love it.
Yeah, thank you. I like to say that we're going up into Neptune. I like to say Uranus is the thought that helps us know that we can build this thing. He's also the lightning bolt that might strike us to our death as we're trying, and that death, the fear of the death, is Pluto. You know, so there's this really cool thing about Saturn and Jupiter on this chart, which we've shown a little bit. But Gary mentioned, I love this, Gary, when you were speaking about. In a way, the three seasons, I've been thinking about this because in the old Greek, as we know, there were three seasons. And in Kemet, in Egypt too. In fact, the Great Pyramids, they track the sun during the course of 3 seasons. And one begins here at spring equinox, where Jupiter is on this Standing Rock chart. One begins here at Lammas, where the moon is. And then one begins more in the Sagittarius zone. It's really at Samhain, but you kind of get these divisions of the chart that we, as Western astrologers, where we're usually looking at this 3 sets of 4 or 4 sets of 3. I guess that would be the 3 sets of 4. And it's these fire signs, and it's shown so beautifully here of there is the grand fire trine going on. So Jupiter and Saturn are really, I guess we could say, playing nice in this way. And it also has to do with the moon. I mean, that's not a great way to express that. So I do it in such a not great way so you can clean it up for us. So what do we see in this trine between Jupiter and Saturn, with Saturn and Jupiter's sign and the grand moon?
So Jupiter's faster than Saturn, right? Jupiter takes 12 years to go around. Saturn takes 29. So what we have here is an opening trine. In other words, Jupiter is moving from a conjunction with Saturn towards an opposition. So there's a promise, or there's a development of a promise that was. It would be interesting to see what the prenatal Jupiter-Saturn conjunction was. It would have been in, let's see. Air. We're going into air now from Earth. It would have been maybe in water.
It was Virgo, 19th degree Virgo.
Okay. Right. So yeah, so they were happening for about 200 years in the sign of Earth, and then now the very next one is when we move into air. Okay, so there's this movement of Jupiter away from Saturn, and what's happening here in the sky, you'll notice that as Jupiter's rising, Saturn is dominating the heavens. So during the first half of the cycle, the slower planet is still dominant. The faster planet is still learning how to get out from under the weight of that slower planet. Yeah. And so there's a harmonious relationship, yes, but it's still one in which Saturn is dominating. Jupiter is trying to, get that great distance out. And then in the second half of the cycle, and then with the moon is, as you said, moving from Jupiter to Saturn. So the moon is in that place where when Jupiter reaches that, he'll be the dominant one, right? So the moon is actually rising before Saturn and dominating the sky as Saturn's rising. I think you showed that earlier. The moon was still up as Saturn was rising, right? The moon.
Yeah, we saw that in the heavens. I've closed that software now because it gets the computer fan running. But yeah, the moon and the Saturn at nighttime. And this first half, this waning half moon, Gary, in that episode talked about kind of the unnaturalness of the straight line, And then so these two are here, and Saturn retrograde in that first quarter, that waxing half moon, right? So we just see that like in the night when it's cold out and these kinds of things. And so, yeah, the 20-year movement of when Saturn and Jupiter come together, this used to be the longest cycle known before Uranus and the outer planets were discovered. And it was one of the key political cycles to observe for the history of the evolution of politics, consciousness, humanity, everything, right? So there's a really key point to the fact that Jupiter and Saturn met in the sign of Virgo. And it's like, I haven't said this really while we were looking at, well, where did the sun meet Mercury before this chart, right? Where was the new moon before this chart? And where was the eclipse before this chart? In a way, even though those aren't on the birth chart, like this 18 degrees, 22 minutes Virgo where Jupiter and Saturn met, right? We're not going to, if I even bring in all the asteroids and all this stuff, we don't see anything there. But
you know where it does come in, bro?
What's that?
You know where it does come in?
Well, yeah, hold on one second. I was just going to say that point is on this chart. All these different points of the scenes, and not just the frame as I've described it, are on this chart as well.
It's on the chart twice.
It comes in the 1960s, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we should just show that in more modern time, in a longer cycle of revolution, Uranus, and evolution, Pluto. So when these two get together, it is for real, and they meet because Pluto's orbit is so eccentric, it's not so regular. It's between 130 and 170 years. And the last time they met was 1965 and 1966. They had 3 exact meetings in these very same degrees of Virgo, right, that Jupiter and Saturn had met before the Fort Laramie
in the north node. Yeah, in the north node of this chart. So it's like Jupiter and Saturn, the past for Jupiter and Saturn in this chart is the future for Uranus and Pluto, right? So there's a tying together between the past and the future, and it's like I really think that, or I would really like to believe that it's possible that this idea of these people, these white people who have red hearts or have room in their hearts for some redness maybe, started to come in around the 60s, when this conjunction of Uranus and Pluto reactivated this Jupiter and Saturn thing,
And there totally was, right? This is when like a Nepi came out to the Western world, and like the native wisdom sent an invitation for modern Americans to come and learn from ancient Americans, right? And so that happened at this Uranus-Pluto coming together in the sign of Virgo, which we talked a lot about in the Node episode, but prayer and devotion and yoga and earth and the leaf of the tree, as I like to say, right? And so Standing Rock had this essence of Jupiter and Saturn, like living in that place. So when Uranus and Pluto came, they activated that energy in the Standing Rock chart, and kind of, it's like the sleeper cell, or that awakening, that whispered word that brings that part of a chart, these hidden parts of the chart to life.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's coming. It's that. I love how you said that, Gary. Like somebody who's willing to have some red in their heart. Yeah, how about have some blood in our heart, and come back into these native ways. And it's so important now. One of the reasons why I've written in the description for the sharing that we see Standing Rock as a great emanation of kind of what we could say is a predicted revolution on Earth, is because that seed that was planted with revolution and evolution, Uranus and Pluto, in the 60s, which, yes, was Vietnam, but was also the Civil Rights Act, and consciousness, freedom, and hippies, and Sergeant Pepper's is an example I love, but also people coming back to the native wisdom of this land. And now we're seeing it very much emerge, and we're seeing this unification of, and even in the media, of Montgomery and Standing Rock and these themes of the 60s in this current time. And one of the ways that that's been shown, or I guess, I don't know if prophesized is the right word, but predicted by the astrological happenings, is that in our modern time, Uranus and Pluto, who had formed what we could say is a new moon for them, a new Uranus-Pluto in the 60s, well, the new moon, the cycles, right, are new moon and then first quarter moon, the waxing half moon. And this happens with longer cycles, this 130 to 170 year cycle. So the square of Uranus and Pluto started in 2012, and there's 7 exact alignments, and the first one was June 24th, 2012. And there were 7 of these alignments through 2015. And the energy, in a way, is still alive, but I just want to show where these planets are now. Because if I bring in some of the Standing Rock planets, like look at where Mercury is.
Boom, right on Mercury.
So Uranus is aligning to Mercury. And if I bring this back to this quadrant house system, as it's called, Pluto is coming to align with this angle of the Standing Rock chart, or due south at the time of sunrise. And very importantly right now, while Uranus is what's called conjuncting Mercury, having already in 2008 visited Jupiter, it's a little bit later than that, and then later seeing Mars, and now it's aligning to Mercury. As we see, look right now, Mars and Pluto coming together at this angle of this chart, and Pluto is in a trine to the Standing Rock Pluto. So now we're getting into some more advanced astrological language in places I didn't want to go right now, but this is part of the evolving and the shaping and the awakening of the promise of this nativity, which isn't going to happen probably during the course of one human lifetime, because we're not looking at a chart of a human, we are looking at a chart of a nation, right? Many nations even.
We're looking at a chart of the latest incarnation of a nation, the latest I don't know if I would say incarnation, the latest sort of, what am I saying? Embodiment.
There's not even a word for it.
There's not, I mean, this nation was already, had already been in 2 forms that we know of. This is the 3rd form that we know of, right? And it's been a very tortuous journey for them, which, I think the Pluto thing definitely symbolizes. I mean, a lot of people, Pluto was discovered in the 1930s, and a lot of people, associate the Nazi Germany thing with Pluto because of that, But, to me, Pluto wasn't discovered at the time of this treaty. Saturn was, and I mean, I think Saturn fits the bill for the sort of megalomaniac tyrant that's capable of genocide. But now that we have Pluto, you can see, oh wow, Sun conjunct Pluto. I mean, it would have been nice if they had Pluto and had an astrologer who knew what it was about, right? Because it probably would have been like, as tempted as you are to sign this treaty, don't do it, because that Sun is, coming up on the Pluto thing there. And
well, speaking of about coming up on the Pluto thing. We're kind of on a roll here, Gary. Do you want to move out into the invisible space, or do you want to wrap this thing up with the visible rings of Saturn, or how are you feeling right now?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to do, if you want to wrap it up for Saturn and move in that direction, or do you want to just keep going in this one?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm feeling is, yeah, let's, for the sake of time, let's hit stop on this episode 7.
Okay.
7,
Right.
also the number of the visible planets, right? The luminaries of Moon and Sun, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. 7, this great sacred number. And then in the next episode, we'll talk about some of these invisible planets, their discoveries, how they work on this chart, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. Maybe speak a little bit about the asteroids, tie the chart together, and then we're done with the nativity and ready to move into some of the historical happenings in the planetary alignment.
Okay.
So, hey, I appreciate your time so much, Gary, and your teachings. I mean,
I appreciate your amazing grasp of the subject in such a short time, man. I mean, you blow me away with your ability to rap about this, something that I've been doing for 20 some years, and you're keeping right along, man. You'd have no problem keeping pace, and so it's wonderful for me too. And it's really powerful to be able to speak about this subject, hopefully in a way that raises awareness and send some positive, loving, spiritual energy to our brothers and sisters up there.
yeah, this is us sharing what we could say is our medicine. Like Gary and I we're crazy astrologers. This is what
This is what we got, and we're putting it out there towards that, and hopefully it'll be a small addition of loving energy to that movement.
And so what do you do, and how can you share? A lot of people are asking me this, and people are writing it kind of this in defeated, well, what can we do about it? Well, just share your love, share your heart, tell your mom. Does she know about Standing Rock?
Right?
Friends, you know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
spread the word, be involved. You don't have to be angry. You don't have to pick up a weapon. If you can go
Please
out,
don't.
if you're free to go
Yeah.
there, people on the land, that's, I would love to say that I'm out there right now, and I'm not. So this is a way that I'm sharing, among many other ways. And you can connect for the communities and prayer. All sorts of things are happening in your town, and if they're not, you can start them. And so if you have leads of places people can contribute, again, there's a list of things here in the description below. But add things, send us comments, and I'll add them to the list, and let's all do this together, and let's stay awake and decide to awaken further by looking at the harsh reality, not only of the history, but of the present moment, so we can dream forward a better future together in peace, in love, and unity.
Aho.
Aho. Thank you, brother. I will see you in episode 8.
All right.